Hi, Dr. Donald Jervich here with part 3 of the 4M of mobility. And in this presentation, we're going to be looking at how to design a mobility plan for older adults. And I would just provide a little nod here to this somewhat famous marathoner, Ed Whitlock from Canada, who's participated in numerous marathons. I believe he's reached the age of 100, and so he's quite a fixture, if you will. And remarkably, as you can see in the background here, he reports that he practices in his hometown in Ontario at a local cemetery. So there's a little touch of irony there, I think, from a geriatrician's point of view, but there may be other interpretations of that. As a reminder, we'd like you to access the Dakota Geriatrics website for further educational information and little deeper dives into some of the topics that we're talking about. This is a HRSA-funded project for the GWEPs, and perhaps as background information, the Dakota Geriatrics GWEP is one of 47 different GWEPs across the country. So the goals in this presentation are to report why mobility plans impact what matters, as well as has an impact on medical complexity. Also, we want to assess the readiness and capacity of older adults for improving their exercise commitment. And we want to consistently prescribe and reinforce the concept that the older adult engage in 4 elements of a mobility plan. So the mobility plan may be new language for the older adult, because you may say, are you exercising? And they'll say no. Or so how about your physical activity? And they may not know that. And then all of a sudden you say mobility plan, and they go, what does that mean? So it's an icebreaker that you can use to address these 4 elements of physical activity. And then also just to add the enhancements of physical activity or the mobility plan with nutritional considerations and motivational interventions. So some of the barriers to mobility are sedentariness. And so we know that as people get older, as seen here in the graph, that they become more either chair-bound, bed-bound, and just generally not getting around. And there's a whole concept of where their space even becomes shrinks because they don't perhaps go to church anymore, or they don't go to the shopping mall, and so they become more and more homebound over time. The other point that I've stressed previously is that, and emphasized with patients, is that there's 1% yearly loss of lean body mass, and so that really reinforces the concept that you've got to pump the iron or stretch the bands, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the differences about stretch bands versus weights. The pervasive and prevalence of osteoarthritis really does limit a lot of people, particularly people who are whose occupations were manual labor, farmers, automotive workers, mechanics, and so forth, janitorial work. There's a lot of residual arthritis that may be a barrier to consistent physical activity and we need to address that. There may be safety concerns, like, can't go out because there's ice out on the sidewalk, as we see in the Dakotas, or alternatively, it may be, if I go out in my neighborhood, I run the possibility of stray bullet getting me. So yeah, there's some very numerous reasons why safety may be an issue, and that needs to be addressed too. Also, just the sheer side effects of solitude and loneliness demotivates people, and so they may not be up for increasing their physical activity just because of their sense of loneliness and the depressive symptoms that occur with that. Well, on the positive side, the rationale for mobility plan is that there's a massive reduction in risk for cardiovascular events such as stroke and heart attacks. And so it's also, as we'll see, the more vigorous the exercise, the lower the risk or the more advantageous it becomes for risk reduction. I often tell people that the only way that we know really to prevent Alzheimer's is to exercise. It also turns out that there's some studies that show that routine vaccination is associated with a lower dementia rate. So that's another talking point that I use with the individuals that are reluctant to get vaccinated. We certainly know that physical activity improves biologic age, and that's an important construct that as we consider geriatrics as to whether biologic age may be a metric or a parameter that might replace things like your hemoglobin A1C or your cholesterol is at a certain level, rather to talk to the patient about their biologic age and how their physical activity may impact that. Finally, the mobility plan is really a way to address what matters to the older adult. And as seen in this picture here, just perhaps simply lifting a grandchild up may be an ability that has been lost with age, but can be rejuvenated through a mobility plan. And there's a famous German commercial that shows this old man pumping irons, and everybody's looking at him. What is he doing? Well, at the end, he goes to a holiday party and lifts his granddaughter up and gives her a hug. And that was a very touching moment as to why he was motivated to increase his resistance training and his strength ultimately. So in assessing the mobility plan, as I had mentioned earlier, you firstly want to ask how or if the older adult has a mobility plan. And that, again, may give a little bit of a pause, and they'll say, well, what do you mean by that? And then that is an icebreaker that can launch into a more in-depth discussion. And also through that discussion and questioning, we might ask about their knowledge and experience with the 4 elements of the plan. Are you doing any strength training, or have you? What about walking or other biking? Perhaps are you doing any balance or core exercises? And then are you stretching, or are you doing yoga? In that conversation, we want to evaluate some of the barriers to physical activity, which sometimes the older adult may share with you extemporaneously. Those might include pain. I can't do things because my shoulder bugs me, or I get short-winded. These are all important. Also identifying social isolation. I just sit in front of TV and watch programs all day, for somebody that's living by themselves. So we try to establish what their readiness for change might be, and how good are they at self-managing and initiating things. Somebody, for instance, that's managing their blood pressure by bringing in a diary and saying, I'm a little worried about these values of 140 to 150 for stretches of a time. What should I do about them? That's a high level, high performing self-management, self-efficacy type patient, as opposed to, in contrast, an individual who has high blood pressure and never checks their blood pressure. And so too is the same issue that in parallels with the mobility plan to consider people that are highly motivated versus what we call the refuseniks. Those people just no way, no how. And you have to try to move the needle from going from those non-participants into the average to highly participatory group. Obesity can be a consideration. Again, 1/3 of the population is considered obese, and so that certainly is a challenge in terms of combining weight loss with physical activity, which are physical activity has been shown as a mechanism for weight loss. But then the problem is that when you start exercising, you get hungrier and you start eating more, and so it's always that delicate balance between the physical activity and caloric restriction. And then finally, the other point is to try to understand if the older adult has equipment available to them. Do they go to a wellness center or to a gym? Do they have a treadmill or an exercise bike in their house? Do they have stretchy bands, that they can use, exercise bands or weights and so forth? So we want to create a mobility plan, and again, focusing on, I'm an advocate, and I'll explain why shortly here, that for the stretch bands, just because of their portability and their equivalency to weights, we want to do core balance training, which is represented, I'm sorry, over here in the right-hand panel, with the yoga move where called the tree, and you don't need to keep the foot above the knee like the typical yoga maneuver, but you do have to encourage the older adult to have something to grab onto, and then they let go of that reinforcement as they try to balance themselves. And then the aerobic physical activity here, perhaps with walking sticks, is what we would advocate. And then finally, flexibility, as shown here by stretching through the psoas stretch here. So it turns out that a few studies have revealed that the exercise bands or stretchy bands or therabands, however you want to call them, are equivalent to weights for resistance training. And because of their portability and inexpensiveness, if you will, they're considered the preferred method for promoting resistance training and strength improvement in the older adult. So, and I just wanted to share with these different color bands, that typically in commercial stores you can go from yellow. So that's what you start off with, because that has about 3 to 4 pound resistance. And honest to gosh, if you ever went into a nursing home and asked people to lift a can of soup, a lot of them couldn't do it, right? I mean, they barely 3 pounds is about what they can do. So that's why you want to start at a lower level and progress upwards according to the I guess the darkness of the band, with the black band being the most resistance, basically being 10 pounds equivalents of resistance training. And of course, once you get to that level, you can go to the silver and gold bands, and beyond that, you may need to go to weights. With reference to core balance training, already talked about the tree maneuver in yoga, but Tai Chi is proven for improving core balance, and there are Tai Chi programs that are offered. I'll just share with you an anecdote that I introduced when I was working in the Veterans Hospital, and I asked, this is really bad, but I asked the older fellow, veteran, if he would go to his local senior center for Tai Chi, and he looks at me and he says, "I thought we won that war." Like, totally confused about what the meaning is. But the other way to do balance training is what I had introduced previously, was this so-called force plate balance. And again, you put pressure on different parts of the plate with a cursor in front of a computer screen, and that allows you to adjust your core balance and shows improvement over time. In terms of endurance or aerobic training, the recommendations are 7,500 steps a day, so that's just a little over 4 miles. It doesn't all have to be done at once, and so that's why we encourage a tracking device, I should say. And then the concept of high intensity interval training versus continuous training for aerobic performance, somewhat controversial in the older adult population, because the issue is how rapidly individuals recover from high intensity interval training. And so there's this high intensity interval training is again, it's just controversial. Just suffice it to say that they're equivalent. One is not superior to the other. In terms of flexibility training, I like to promote the legs separated, with the opposite arm from the forward leg being lifted to help with the psoas and flexion stretch of the back. This is also a demonstrated posture for hip and extensor flexion. I'm saying that incorrectly. Hip flexion and extension flexibility. And then also the treadmills are important elements for getting increased hip extension. The treadmill belt forces the older adult to have a little longer stride. And I guess just what I'm pointing out here is that on the left-hand side is a stand-up flexibility training, which is probably applicable to most individuals. Once you have any limbs or motion towards the ground, I think it should be evaluated by a either personal trainer or a physical therapist as to that older adult's capacity to do that. Because some people, when they go to the ground, they're so weak they can't get back up. I'd mentioned about some adjuvants to physical activity. We know that the older adult requires more protein, so it's 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of protein daily. And I basically say, if you think about it, the current Boost, Carnation, Ensure, whatever the product is, they now have about 30 grams of protein per either bottle or bar. So that would give you a sense of that you would need to have 2 of those supplements to meet your protein requirements in addition to what you're eating daily. I also emphasize the Mediterranean diet because that shows that it's associated with good cognitive health and preservation of brain function. Sometimes for somebody who doesn't think so much about the Mediterranean diet, I mentioned about the gladiator diet, which is also a reference to the Mediterranean diet. The addition of or prescription of energy supplements is probably not recommended so much because the one energy generator, which is a vitamin B3 precursor, nicotinamide riboside, really has limited studies in the older adult population. Although if you look at the preclinical studies with animals, it's like remarkable. It's like it turns them into younger individuals. But there's not that much research on the human population, so can't really be an advocate of that. But it would be a consideration, and there is some evidence for plant supplementals such as turmeric for reducing osteoarthritis pain. So there might be a opportunity to consider that if somebody's into alternative medicine or complementary medicine. Finally, the additional consideration is to try to keep the patient motivated. We know, for example, that individuals that participate in group exercise do really, really well, and they're very, they show great improvement. But then after a while, when they leave the group sessions, they tend to drift and not sustain their exercise commitment. So that's why some of the research demonstrates that text messaging and partnering with another individual is often highly reinforcing and improves exercise compliance by up to 30%. Pain is always an issue, right? People will talk about my hip hurts or my joints hurt. So one of the interventions there is to consider pre-medication with Tylenol extra strength before physical activity. So basically providing acetaminophen to 500 milligrams prior to physical activity. I'd already mentioned the issue about turmeric for knee osteoarthritis. The dosages vary according to the study. Just as a rough guideline, I use 1,500 milligrams twice daily. And it has to build over time. It's not like a pain medication per se. It just helps reduce the inflammatory markers that might be occurring with the arthritis or aging. We'll also prescribe a personal trainer, again, if the individual can afford it. It's not covered by Medicaid or Medicare. A lot of community-based group exercise programs and the evidence-based programs such as Stepping On results in fall reduction by up to 30%. So they're definitely evidence-based and to be encouraged. So I just wanted to share with you a conceptual framework for how to document in the progress notes. So this is all the 4 M's. And I just want to stress that on the left side here are all the assessments that we do. And we want to do these assessments on a consistent basis. In some instances, we can carry over the assessment to the next clinical encounter. And likewise, we carry over the action plan with each clinical encounter to build on that. And so you can see the different examples, and if you want, you can zero in on the different elements of the 4 M's. But we want to, for this presentation, emphasize mobility. And so you can see in this particular case, a mock patient here who has a gait speed of 1.4 meters per second, so it's considered screen negative for falls. The mobility plan was asked of the patient. They said they're not doing any of the 4 elements. And so then that provides an action plan where the provider refers to the, in North Dakota, the NDC3 website with emphasis on looking and joining the Stepping On program, which is provided at the Senior Center, for instance. We provide patient education. I showed you those different elements of flexibility and the stretch band therapy. So that would be patient education, which can be reinforced with a patient brochure on from the National Institute on Aging, for example. Making a referral to the Wellness Center or YMCA. Encouraging something equivalent, not that I'm endorsing Fitbit, but rather a exercise band or monitor or a pedometer, for example, because the idea is that you want to prescribe 7,500 steps per day, and they don't all have to be done at once. They don't have to be done outside. They don't have to be done at a gym. You could simply step in place while you're watching commercials on TV, and that counts. And then in terms of the patient-centered medical home, the health coach follow-up or provider follow-up to reinforce 1 week later. We talked about this mobility plan. What say you? Have you started it? And if so, how's it going? And that's very reinforcing. Just would like to also share the resources. There's clinical brochures in the clinic that we can get from the National Institute on Aging. There are other programs like the STEADY program from the CDC, which I list down here. Local resource, state resources are the NDC3 website. And then good resources are the National Institute on Aging, as well as Silver Sneakers. And again, I often tell people that there's 2 components that we really need to focus on. One is the aerobic, and then the muscle strengthening at a minimum, and then leading to the core and flexibility, perhaps as an add-on as we go. But the idea is that you want to make the physical activity fun. So that's why they list all these different components, whether they be walking the dog, for example, and you might use that as a source of, like, if you go walking the dog for 2 blocks, well, maybe next time try 3 blocks. So you have this progressive increase towards physical activity. And as a reminder, more is better in terms of both intensity and duration for reducing overall cardiovascular risk factor. So to summarize, we want to assess what people are doing for their mobility plan at each clinical encounter. And we'd like to collaborate as a provider with the older adult to create that mobility plan and to modify it over time. So that's why it has to be addressed with each clinical encounter. We continuously want to check what the barriers are to increasing physical activity. It may have been because I got influenza, or I've got long COVID, I've got brain fog. All of those need to be addressed in terms of disruptions in the maintenance of physical activity, if not the initiation of it. And then we always want to be mindful of the 4 goals of setting up a mobility plan. Firstly, and most importantly, is resistance training. Hands down, the most important thing, because it not only increases strength, it also increases aerobic capacity by building muscle. That's the only way that you can build the mitochondria and to improve the respiratory quotient, and people will feel better as a result of the improved muscle mass. And the other elements are, of course, the aerobic training, the flexibility, and then the core balance training. And then finally, just to consider nutrition as an opportunity when we talk about the mobility plan, to include and emphasize the increased needs of protein supplementation, or if not supplementation, improving the protein intake with their regular diet. And those can be achieved by grains such as oats and high protein level dairy products. There's certain products out there that have higher proteins, as well as supplementation products that we're all familiar with, whether they be in a liquid form or a granola type bar form. Doesn't make any difference. So thank you for your attention on this, and I hope that you do apply the 4Ms consistently, and that in the context of the mobility, that you firstly do fall risk and get an action plan for fall risk, and then assess whether there's a mobility plan and that there's an action plan for the mobility plan. So two components to the application of the 4M of mobility, which includes understanding the fall risk and its intervention, as well as the overall exercise plan for the older adult. Thank you, and if you have additional questions or interest, please access the Dakota Geriatrics website for further educational materials. Thank you.